Good evening. Welcome to our Horological Masters series. Thomas Tompion, who was the greatest English watch and clockmaker of the 17th century, was much more famous in his own time than today. He was, therefore, suffering the reverse fate of that of the famed Thomas Chippendale, for little regard was paid to this new celebrated craftsman by his contemporaries. Tompion's fame continued throughout the 18th century, slowly faded through the 19th century, and at the present has been saved from total oblivion by just a few clock collectors who discovered the rare merit of the highest quality and design of his clocks and watches. Watch and clock making was comprised of crude iron clocks which, by the 16th century, were fitted into most church towers throughout England and were made by English blacksmiths. These craftsmen also were responsible for the smaller scale domestic clocks that were available then. The making of clocks which showed the changes of the moon, the ebb and flow of the tides, the day of the month, the position of the planets in the zodiac, and which were encased in copper and gilt frames, decorated with engravings and enameling, and sometimes set in glass cases, was far beyond the skill of the local blacksmith. These types of clocks displayed greater precision and the workmanship of a much higher order. Such a craft can easily be identified with that of the locksmith. In due time, these locksmiths became clockmakers, and a later yet finer brand of workmanship was honed over and over again. Watchmaking, a further division of the craft. The little information that has been garnered indicates that the English product was far behind both in quality and ingenuity of design of the best work of the corresponding French and German masters. It should be understood that Elizabethan clocks were weight and spring driven, were exceedingly poor timekeepers. They were so erratic that they needed to be corrected at times on a daily basis by the use of a sundial, and watches were even less reliable at that point. The period from 1600 to 1660 was an all-important one in the English craft of watch and clockmaking. It saw the English school established, a time when they first offered an individual national character so they could be distinguished from others or their contemporaries, French and German examples. The first clock to adopt an English form was a variation on the continental brass weight. This wall-driven clock, popularly known today as a lantern clock. In the first quarter of the 17th century, the little band of London clockmakers continued to increase the numbers through the arrival of many immigrants, clockmakers. They were known as strangers beyond the seas to the English, but they were heavy competition. And this competition was, of course, unwelcomed with great jealousy and dissension, and continued to arise between the London and the foreign craftsmen. A formal complaint by the local craftsmen to the king was presented by the majority of the clockmakers in the London area. One of the accusations against the strangers was that they went to the chambers of gentlemen and sold their products which were inferior in work. Whether they were or not, we don't know. They probably were not. They were probably actually superior. The difficulties of the London clockmakers arose from the fact that they were without a charter, when in the past they were blacksmiths/clockmakers. They belonged for the most part to the blacksmith company. But now they were just a loose body of craftsmen following the same trade and unaffiliated to any of the great London guilds, or as they were termed then, corporations. They were thus deprived the right to search and to seize insufficient and deceitful work, which would enable them to enter the workshops of their French and German competitors and generally keep them under control. Their aim was to divide and rule, for they could not exclude these foreigners. According to a 1628 charter, the English clockmakers of London asked the blacksmiths if they would allow them all to join their guild or their company. The answer was a resounding no. In 1631, a chapter of incorporation was granted, satisfying the long-felt need of the London clockmakers for official recognition. Thenceforth, they were known as the Master Wardens and Fellowship of the Art or Mastery of Clocks of the City of London. What a large title. With their own company and the protection it afforded the London clockmakers, both English and alien, became united at last. And the craft of clock and watchmaking in England was fully established. In the first half of the 17th century, clock making in the provincial centers also improved, for they developed the standards of the Clock Company of London. From making only iron church and chamber clocks, provincial craftsmen now became sufficiently skilled to execute watchwork. A great advance was made in the art of clockmaking when Christian Huygens, and Huygens was from Amsterdam, the Dutch mathematical genius, discovered between 1655 and 1656 the way of using a clock pendulum as a clock regulator. Huygens assigned his invention to a master clockmaker in The Hague, Solomon Koster, and by 1657 the new clocks were in production, or some of the old clocks were being converted to the new pendulum system, a great advancement in timekeeping. Reports of the Dutch pendulum quickly spread throughout the town of London. And before the year was out, John Fromentil went to Holland and entered Koster's services. He was an apprentice to learn the pendulum mechanism and theory. The appearance of the pendulum clock in London caused such a boom in the clockmaker's trade, for all who could afford it wanted to replace their old balance wheel clock with this new conversion, the new pendule, as Huygens' invention was called. And those who could not afford it had the balance wheel exchanged with the new regulator. The fertile reign of Charles II saw the establishment of English horology blossom. It now became a subject of discussion and investigation of the learned members of the newly founded Royal Society. This included clockmakers, horologists in general, astronomers, mathematicians, and part of the Navy. English clockmakers, no longer blacksmiths, blindly copying existing movements, were now following their own inventions and were producing clocks and watches on English soil. Not only did this apply to the mechanism, but it also applied to the craftsmanship. Watch and clock cases also joined in this evolution.